Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final video lecture for this module on informal fallacies. In this video, we're going to cover slippery slope as well as hasty generalization. Those are the last two informal fallacies that deal with unacceptable premises. And I also want to mention to you that I am not going to cover from the textbook from 12.3 dealing with persuaders and rhetorical moves. This deals less with logic or less with thinking about how our reasoning goes wrong. Instead, what he does in that part of the text is focus on how we can be persuaded or different persuasive ways of arguing rather than analysis of errors in reasoning. Sometimes rhetoric is closely associated with critical thinking, but it's not quite the same thing. It's associated with argumentation insofar as we do want our arguments to be, in some sense, persuasive, but being persuasive is not the same thing as reasoning well. So, for those reasons, I'm not going to cover that material in the textbook. Now, let's go ahead and start talking about slippery slope. What exactly is this fallacy? Well, this fallacy occurs when somebody claims that some action or some particular behavior, let's just call it X, is going to or will end up leading to some other terrible or unacceptable result. Let's call that Y. Right. So the basic idea is if you believe X, if you allow for X to happen, then Y is going to happen too as a result. And nobody wants Y to happen. That would be really terrible. But it's important to recognize here that this sort of reasoning occurs without supporting evidence or without justification, because sometimes it is the case that some behaviors can lead to a really bad result. What we need evidence or justification for why we're making that inference. Without the necessary evidence or justification, it's a slippery slope. A classic example of this was when people used to argue that gay marriage is morally wrong and that we should not allow for gay marriage because it's going to result in all sorts of different terrible things and society might fall apart. And you may not really remember this, but this is something that used to come up all the time. People used to argue that if we allowed for gay marriage, then the next thing you know, people are going to be marrying their children, or they might marry their pets, or they might get married to an inanimate object like a rock or a chair or something. And those just seem ridiculous, those seem absurd, or just counterintuitive, something that we would not want to accept. Of course, gay marriage has been on the books now for quite a long time, since 2015, and it hasn't happened. None of these things ever actually occurred, right? Society didn't get together and say, we should allow people to marry their pets, or if people want to get married to a rock, then that should be fine. This just never occurred. Indeed, there was never any good reason or good justification that would give us reason to believe that it would actually happen in the first place. It was mostly just a fear tactic. Additionally, it's important to recognize that something like marriage actually requires consent. And in all of those cases, one of the parties cannot give their consent. A young child can't give their consent, a pet cannot give their consent, and clearly a rock can't give their consent either. Now, something that people did oftentimes argue back in the 90s and the early 2000s when this was a really hot topic issue, some people would argue that if we allow for gay marriage, then this is going to lead to something like polygamy. People or society as a whole will start allowing for polygamy. And many people just thought that that would be inappropriate and unacceptable. Again, that's a version of the slippery slope because there's just no good evidence or justification for why we should think that that's the case. Yet at the same time, you might think that that just simply assumes that polygamy is undesirable or problematic in some way. Yet that may not be the case. I mean, there have been different times throughout society when polygamy has been acceptable. In fact, there may be some cultures living on the earth today that believe that polygamy is morally permissible. Indeed, it's not incomprehensible to think that polygamy could be actually a good thing as long as all parties are giving their consent. While you may disagree with that, it's not necessarily a moral atrocity that may come from or lead from allowing for gay marriage. So even if legalizing gay marriage would eventually lead to polygamy, right, that behavior in society alone does not mean that it's a bad thing. Now let's move on to hasty generalization. And remember that we already kind of discussed these when we were talking about different obstacles to critical thinking, to good reasoning. We oftentimes make all sorts of different mistakes and errors in reasoning that are due to things like group centered thinking. For instance, remember from a previous module when we talked about stereotypes and tribalism. These are different forms of group centered thinking that can be also understood in terms of hasty generalization. Likewise, in a few weeks, we're going to look at different forms of errors of reasoning that actually occur with regard to statistical reasoning or maybe causal reasoning. When we're using this sort of data, either causal information or statistical information, where we're trying to draw some conclusion from that information based upon too small of a sample size, which ends up making it a hasty generalization. But for now, for the purpose of this video, let's just make it clear that this is a genuine fallacy, a fallacy of unacceptable premises, insofar as those premises provide inadequate evidence for the conclusion. We just don't have enough information to draw the more general conclusion that is attempting to be derived. But as we saw with previous fallacies, I think that it's going to be helpful to consider some more examples. So let's take a look at those. Someone might say, well, I met two rude people from New York, therefore all people from New York must be rude, right? You can see how this is an example of stereotype or group-centered thinking or in-group, out-group thinking. But it's a clear case of hasty generalization. Even if the person you met from New York, in fact, was rude, that doesn't mean that everybody from New York is rude. Or suppose that for the last two tests in logic, you failed those tests. And then you conclude that you should just give up because you're never going to be good at logic or math, or that like your mind just doesn't work in that sort of way. But if you're making that conclusion, if you're drawing that conclusion just simply from two tests, that's just not enough information. That's too small of a sample size to make the more general conclusion that your mind doesn't work in that way, that you're not a math kind of person or a logic kind of person. Or suppose that you say, look, my grandfather smoked cigarettes his whole entire life and he lived to be 95. Therefore, smoking cannot be bad for you. Well, the mere fact that one person lived to 95 and also smoked that whole entire time, that's just one person. We have lots of other people that die very early due to cancer because of smoking, right? So the one person is not enough information to draw the more general conclusion that smoking is not bad for everybody. Or suppose that you say, look, the food at that restaurant in Italy was really bad, and therefore Italian food is terrible. But we know that's not true. Anybody that's been to Italy knows that the food there is incredible. And you might think that Italian food in general is actually pretty good, even if it's true that there is one bad restaurant that serves Italian food, or one restaurant in Italy that serves bad food. In either case, the information that you're using to draw the conclusion is too small. It's too small of a sample size to move to the more general conclusion that all Italian food is terrible. Or suppose that you said, once I was bitten by a dog, therefore all dogs are dangerous and will bite you. But most of us know dogs that are not dangerous and that are actually quite loving. And so, it's just false to claim that all dogs are dangerous and will bite you, even if it's true that you once were bitten by a dog. Or suppose you find out on the news that there's a Republican politician that was caught red handed lying to his constituents. Therefore, you draw the conclusion that all Republicans are liars. So again, we cannot draw the more general conclusion that all Republicans are liars, even if it's true that some particular politician that's Republican was caught red-handed lying. Or imagine that it happens to snow quite a lot this year during the month of April, and then you conclude that therefore climate change must be a hoax. You notice that even if it's true that it happened to snow at some point in April, or even if it snowed a lot in April, when otherwise it would normally be warm because it's springtime. Well, that does not mean that we have reason to conclude the more general claim about climate change that it is a hoax, right? We don't have enough information to make that generalization. Or here's an example that I quite like. Imagine some student says, my professor, my philosophy professor is really boring. So philosophy is clearly a boring and stupid subject. I mean, it might be true. You might think that maybe I am boring. Maybe these lectures are really difficult to get through. It does not follow, however, that philosophy in general is just boring and stupid. You may actually take another class sometime, and it might be very illuminating. It might be something that you quite enjoy and that you find is not stupid at all. So we can't simply conclude this more broad and general statement that philosophy is boring and stupid, that all of philosophy is boring and stupid, simply because you happen to have a professor, maybe me, that you found to be boring or even stupid. So I hope these examples have helped you think about what hasty generalization is, and we will have a chance to kind of dig into this particular fallacy in a little more detail in a few weeks when we look at statistical and causal reasoning as it relates to inductive arguments.